Welcome, everyone, to the Library of Congress. I'm Andrew Briner of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center was created to bridge the divide between thought and action through conversations and meetings with members of Congress, their staffs, and the broader policy-making community, connecting knowledge and power. On a day-to-day basis, we support scholars doing innovative and specialized work, and we project scholarly work to a broader audience at events like this. We have another public event coming up on August 3rd, and you'll find flyers for that at the front registration table. Today, we're pleased to have Susan V. Lawrence, a Library of Congress staff fellow at the Kluge Center, discussing the interactions between a British national, Michael Lindsay, and the Chinese Communist Party during World War II, and what those interactions tell us about the Communist Party's attitude towards technology then and later. Lawrence has worked at the library since 2010, and earlier in her career, she spent a cumulative 11 years in Beijing as bureau chief and staff reporter for major US news organizations. She is also a granddaughter of Michael Lindsay. After the talk, there will be a reception in the back of the room. If you're watching online, please fill out the virtual survey you will receive when the event ends. And if you're here in person with us, please fill out a survey card so we can make these events the best they can possibly be. Please join me in welcoming Susan Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks to the Kluge Center for hosting me for the last 6 months as a staff fellow. I'm very grateful for the support of the Kluge staff, the collegiality of other fellows, and the chance to dive deep into some of the magnificent resources at the Library of Congress. I've had obscure books delivered to my workspace, I've enjoyed the wonder that is the manuscript division, and I've really gained a lot from the rich Chinese language database resources that the library subscribes to. My research has focused on my maternal grandfather, Michael Lindsay's interaction with the Chinese Communist Party forces during World War II in China. I've been particularly interested in first-person accounts by the Chinese with whom he interacted. All-out war in China began earlier than it did in Europe and the United States. In July 1937, this month marks the 85th anniversary of the start of the official start of the Sino-Japanese War, or World War II in China. And Michael Lindsay was in China for almost the full duration of World War II. He filled multiple roles. I've listed some of them on this slide. I found myself most interested in his interactions with the Communist Party on technology projects. And so you'll see at the bottom here some of the roles that he had related in that area, including as technical advisor to the communists' Jinchaji military region and to their 18th Group Army, and also as a supporter of the Communist Party's anti-Japanese underground efforts in Beijing. So first, a little bit of biographical detail. Michael Lindsay was born in 1909 in London. His mother was an Oxford-educated social activist and author. His father was a prominent academic who would serve for 25 years as the master of Balliol College, Oxford. Importantly for this tale, at age 9, Michael Lindsay caught flu in the 1918 global epidemic. He had 6 operations on his right ear and was left permanently deaf in that ear. And that's relevant because it meant that he was never eligible to serve in the British forces during World War II. This photo shows Michael on the right there with his father, A.D. Lindsay, and his younger sister, Drusilla, when he was about 6 or 7. His father's in uniform for service as Deputy Controller of Labor in France in World War I, overseeing labor, including the Chinese Labor Corps. So Michael's education, he excelled in math, chemistry, and physics at boarding school. He was an amateur radio buff, but his housemaster lamented his failure to acquire the virtue of instinctive or willing obedience, which is something that people would repeat in other forms throughout his life. He was a corporal in the school's officer training corps, which taught him about guns, how to fire them, store them, strip them, and how other armies ought to handle those things. He got a scholarship in natural science to his father's college, Balliol College, Oxford, but after 1 year switched his course to politics, philosophy, and economics, PPE, with a focus on economics. So in 1931, he accepted a job at an American missionary university outside Beijing, Yenjing University. It had extraterritorial status. It was considered to be American territory in China. The US and Japan were not at war, so Japan largely left the university alone. He arrived in January 1938, about 6 months after the Japanese had occupied the city, and was appalled by what he saw of Japanese occupation. He taught tutorial classes with another British academic, George Taylor, who's pictured there in that picture. And the sole woman in this photograph is Michael's future wife, Lindsay, Li Xiaoli, who was a student in one of the tutorials and would later be his collaborator in his work with the communists. So while he was at Yenjing, Michael began supplying the communist resistance movement. He took several long vacations out through communist-held territory, met up with a lot of the communist commanders, and got a better sense of what they were up against. He was not a communist, but he felt an obligation to help Chinese resist Japan, and I think that obligation got stronger after Britain joined the war in 1939, and China was therefore an ally of Britain's in a sort of allied operation. He saw this as his form of war service. He smuggled all sorts of things to the communist forces. He was in a position to do that because he was a British national, and again, the Japanese were not at war with Britain, so they didn't want to cause an incident by stopping him. And he was living on this piece of American territory, Yenjing University. He also had a motorcycle, which was helpful. He had imported it from Britain and had allowed him to drive very fast through Japanese checkpoints with smuggled goods on the back, or sometimes communist operatives on the back of his motorbike. He smuggled medical supplies, radio parts, assembled transceivers, weapons, and occasionally personnel. So Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed that existence. Suddenly, Japan was at war with the United States and Britain. He was no longer safe on the Yenjing University campus. He knew the Japanese would be coming for him. They were quite aware of what he'd been up to. He happened to tune into a radio broadcast from Shanghai in German, which mentioned that something like, now that Japan and the United States are at war, to which he said, time to flee. He grabbed another couple who were at the university, his colleagues, Claire and William Band, and they fled out of the university in the president's car with 5 suitcases of radio parts in the back. They ditched the car outside of Beijing and were met by communist troops that Lindsay had been supplying. And this is a photograph of their first night after meeting up with the communist forces. So this is just a map that gives you a little bit of a sense of what was happening in the war at that time. This is covering a slightly tiny little bit later period, 1941 to 1942. It's a communist-produced map, so it's reflecting the communist view of this history. But I included it mainly to show you some of these orange areas. So the purple is Japanese-controlled territory. This is Japanese-occupied territory. The dotted lines, the dots there, are areas of resistance, areas where the guerrillas are active trying to sabotage the Japanese. That means to try to sabotage railway lines and roads and other ways in which the Japanese were trying to control the area. The orange are anti-Japanese so-called base areas. So these were areas that the communists controlled and where they were trying to build out their power. You'll see, do I have a pointer? I'm not sure if I have a pointer. Maybe I have a pointer. Okay, so you'll see on the right, anyway, the big orange splotch on the right is the Jinchaji base area, where my grandparents would spend the first part of the war from 1941 to early 1944. And then the orange to the left of that is the Shanganning base area, where's the Communist Party headquarters, where they would spend the last year and a half of the war. One more thing to notice about this map is it explains why radio was so important, because the communists didn't control contiguous areas, they were controlled bits and pieces of territory, and there were large areas which the Japanese controlled, but the communists were involved in guerrilla activities. They needed to be able to have effective radio communications to communicate across Japanese-controlled areas. So they escaped, met up with the communists, and they ended up going to the Jinchaji base area, which was led by Rongzhen. He becomes a key figure in this narrative. He was the commander of the Jinchaji military region. He had been born in 1899, so he was exactly a decade older than Michael Lindsay. But he had worked and studied in France, Belgium, and the Soviet Union. He had studied chemistry. He was extremely well educated for an early Communist Party leader. He worked very, very hard to get Michael Lindsay and his colleague William Band. Band had been the chairman of the physics department at Yenjing University. He worked very hard to get them to stay in Jinchaji. Normally, foreigners escaping from the occupied areas in Beijing would get out to the communist areas and really were just trying to get out to Chongqing, where they could then get a plane or some form of transportation out of China and back home. But Rongzhen wanted Band and Lindsay to stay, and it turned out that they were part of a much bigger scientific effort that he had underway. Rongzhen was thinking very long term. So they arrived, and he began to court them. He gave them a welcome banquet. He personally accompanied them around the base area. He ended up assigning a courtyard to them to live in. He assigned them a cook who would cook them both Western food and Chinese food. He assigned an English-speaking manager for the compound because the bands did not speak Chinese. Michael did speak Chinese, and it got a lot better. And of course, Michael's wife, by this time, Xiao Li, was a native Chinese, so language wasn't so much an issue for them, but it was helpful for others to have that English-speaking manager. And what Rongzhen wanted them to do was to teach advanced radio engineering classes to a hand-picked group of students that he'd gathered from around the base area. He'd actually started this advanced radio engineering class earlier, but it hadn't really got off the ground because it didn't have anybody in it or anybody teaching it who really knew what they were doing. He didn't have somebody with really deep expertise in these subjects. So the group had been assembled, but they were having trouble making progress. Rongzhen said, aha, I have now got my instructors. I've got Michael Lindsay, William Band. I'll have them teach this class. Ended up pulling 26 soldiers from around the base area to be members of this advanced radio class. Some of them had some level of university education. Others of them were just very good at technology, but hadn't had extensive education. Rongzhen sent out to the major cities for textbooks and other teaching materials, but until they arrived, Band and Lindsay had to work out a lot of the syllabus from memory. Rongzhen assigned a former Tsinghua University electrical engineering student, Wang Shiguang, to be their assistant, and he was known to the other students as the assistant professor. And the students, in their later accounts of this period, say that they saw Band as the stronger at theory, which makes sense. He was the chairman of the physics department and had taught in China for a while at that point. But Lindsay is stronger at practical applications, Lindsay having been a lifelong radio ham, radio buff who had put together a lot of radios in his time. They had compulsory classes in calculus, physics, electrical principles, and radio engineering. They had electives, you'll see, in advanced calculus, theoretical electromagnetism, optics, wireless theory, quantum theory, relativity. At one point, William Band said to Rongzhen, "Do you really need us to be teaching this to your soldiers? You are in the middle of a war. Do you not need these guys to be doing something more practical?" And Nie's response, according to Band, was that after the war, China will need all the engineers she can muster, and not only engineers, but patriotic engineers. And this would be a key theme throughout The communists' time and power, this idea that you want people who are both expert and read. But anybody who had left their university studies in Beijing to come up and join the communists in those early days was considered to be showing some pretty strong red credentials. And so he trusted them. But he also, having trusted them, they were there, they were red, but he really wanted them to become really hotshot scientists, engineers, technicians. So they came up with a quite clever way to teach these classes. They divided the group into an A group and a B group. The A group, who had stronger English skills and had had more university education, studied directly with Band and Lindsay in English. And then 3 members of that A group, including Wang Shiguang, retaught each class to a B group in Chinese. That was a group that had less strong English skills, or maybe none at all, less strong technical skills, so they would reteach it. And that's how they operated for the full 2 years that they taught this class. The party, strikingly, assigned these 26 students no other duties. They had no other duties at all. Their sole duty was to master physics, calculus, and electromagnetism, wireless theory, quantum theory, relativity, you name it. That was their job. There was very strong camaraderie in this group. They were operating in very difficult conditions. They had limited food. They were all living in very close quarters, but very strong ties that grew among these 26 students. And they really knuckled down and learned the curriculum. And Band had been the chairman of the physics department. He was insistent that they were going to run this like a university class, a university course. So he gave them weekly quizzes, monthly tests. He wrote up very detailed evaluations of every student on a regular basis, really held them to a very high standard. Nia was completely behind this. Rongzhen also supported the establishment of a Jinchaji Natural Science Association, which gave the students a chance to exchange scientific ideas in an academic-like setting. Band and Lindsay and several of their students served on the board of the Jinchaji Natural Science Association, which today is celebrated in a huge way in China. They see this as an early example of China embracing advanced science. Lindsay and Band and several of their students gave presentations. Lindsay's presentations, as recorded in the local paper and in the Natural Science Association journal, included talks on topics such as principles and manufacture of sundials and the manufacture of silencers. So ultimately, Band ended up, he had some poor health, it was difficult conditions. He ended up leaving China in August 1943. Lindsay stayed on. He stayed on until the spring of 1944. So he continued to teach the classes, and he had other work. So he also signed on to be a technical advisor to the Jinchaji military region. This is something that Band seems not to have done. Band was content to continue being an educator and to just teach this advanced radio engineering class. Lindsay felt that he wanted to do more. So he signed on, formally commissioned into the Communist Army as a technical advisor to the Jinchaji military region. And among the things he did here was that he proposed a way to upgrade the radios that they were using across the base area for military communications. He wanted to improve the frequency stability. He wanted to make the sets lighter. So he came up with a plan. The old sets had plain Hartley oscillators in very large boxes. The new transmitters used a master oscillator power amplifier circuit and logarithmic tappings on the output coil to adjust the loading, and I'm not going to explain what that means because I'm still just struggling to get there myself. But what it meant was that the radios had much better frequency stability, and they could be fitted into a much smaller box of about 10 by 6 inches, 8 by 6 inches, and they could be strapped onto the back of a soldier who was running out to engage in guerrilla warfare. And Wang Shiguang was again assigned to help. Wang Shiguang, the assistant professor, was also assigned to implement Lindsay's plan to upgrade the radios across the region. And Lindsay ended up traveling out to all the sub-districts across the base area to rebuild their radios, rebuild them according to this new model that he'd come up with, which gave them this much more stable frequency and made them lighter. And he ended up upgrading. He was kind of proud that he had upgraded all the radios in the base area before he left for Yenan in the spring of 1944. But it also meant that he engaged not just with those 26 students who were in the advanced radio engineering class, who were the creme de la creme of the scientific personnel that they had, but he also engaged with all the operators in all the base area, in all the sub-districts who were working these radios, and he was engaging with their bosses. And a lot of these people would go on to be key figures later in China, too. So a little bit more about these students. So as I said, Commander Nie handpicked 26 of them. 18 of them stayed for the full 2 years. A few of them ended up leaving a few months earlier for other tasks. Nie went on, those of you who know China will be familiar with his name. He went on to lead China's drive to develop the nuclear bomb, the hydrogen bomb, satellites, missiles. He was very successful in all of these things. He was a fantastically influential Chinese leader of scientific development. He, in those programs in the 50s and 60s, perhaps naturally, appointed people he trusted to key positions in all those programs. The people he seemed to trust most were those people that he had known in Jinchaji, people who had been among those hand-picked 26 that he had brought together for this advanced radio engineering class. So it's kind of extraordinary when you look at the names of these 26, how many of them went on to really, really important positions. One of them ended up as the Minister of Post and Telecommunications. 3 of them were vice ministers, but that kind of understates their influence. And perhaps another way to explain their influence, some of you will know the name Chen Xuesen. He was the nuclear physicist who left. He was driven out of the United States during the McCarthy era, went back to China, and is credited with helping to give China the bomb. Chen Xuesen, when he showed up in China, was a bit of an unknown quantity. People didn't know whether he was read, whether he could be trusted. Rongzhen really liked his scientific bona fides, though, took him in, and Rongzhen set up something. There was the Ministry of Defense's No. 5 Bureau, which was the Missile Management Bureau. That's what Chen Xuesen initially joined. But Rongzhen made sure to assign, as Chen Xuesen's boss, one of the former students from the advanced radio engineering class in Jinchaji, Zhong Fuxiang, who would go on to be a minister. He was Chen Xuesen's boss, and Chen Xuesen's deputy was another student from the advanced radio engineering class in Jinchaji, Lin Shuang. Lin Shuang would go on to be the chief designer of China's first domestically produced ballistic missile. So that just gives you a hint of sort of who some of these people went on to be. Some of those people wrote accounts later of their time in Jinchaji, studying with Lindsay and Band and under the overall direction of Rongzhen. And they've credited that time with teaching them how to do all sorts of things that became very important to their later careers. That period taught them how to do science, how to approach science, scientific method, the idea that you experiment with things fail, you do them again, it's okay, failure is not the end. You keep going. It taught them about how to manage projects. A big project that they were dealing with that Lin Shuang, the designer of the first ballistic missile, credits from this time, was the project to upgrade all these radios across the base area. Lindsay had come up with this plan for how to do it. They implemented it, but the way they ended up doing it, they decided to upgrade a few and then assign one team to be the folks who would test these and test them again, make sure that the upgrade really was better and was working, and only then to deploy it elsewhere. But also deploying it elsewhere, they ran into a few problems because there was a lot of resistance from technicians across the base area who were not so keen on having a whole new technology to have to learn, and really were sort of grousing about why they couldn't just keep using the old, less stable, clunkier radios. So they realized that they needed to train the operators. They needed to have a whole separate session for the operators, and that's partly what Lindsay was doing, going around the base areas, sub-districts, was teaching people how to use these new machines. But that was an idea for project management that they would then apply in all sorts of other ways. And then just the experience of how you digest foreign expertise, foreign technology. China in the 70s and 80s after Mao's death became very interested, and 90s and 2000s and 2010s, China became very interested in foreign expertise, foreign technology. But there are these issues about how you digest that effectively. And again, Jinchaji, they came up with some really quite effective ways of incorporating different approaches, different technologies, and making it all work. This is just a light relief slide. Personal life at this time, in the middle of all this, Michael's wife, Xiaoli, gave birth to a daughter, Erica, in October 1942, in a breech birth on a mountaintop. He wasn't there because he was off in a sub-district, upgrading radios and teaching people how to work them. And he didn't come for quite a long time, and I have Xiaoli's diary in which she, week by week, says, where is he? Is it really so important that the radios get upgraded? Couldn't he come and be here with his wife and daughter? But this is a picture of Erica as a toddler, playing with a clip of machine gun ammunition, sitting in front of a bunch of boxes where the communists seem to be rather proudly displaying their artillery rounds and their mortar bombs and other items. And yes, Erica is my mother. So when Lindsay had finished upgrading all the radios across the base area, and he felt that he had trained everybody who could possibly be trained, he sort of thought his work was done. And Nie felt that having given his 26 crack technicians 2 years of intensive study of physics and calculus, that maybe that 2 years was about enough. It was time to move on. So Lindsay decided to go to the Communist Party headquarters. He had a number of things he wanted to do there, but he expected that he would be involved again with technology. This is just a photograph just of Chairman Mao in the middle of that photograph. Lindsay's to the left in his Chinese army uniform. To the right are some members of a foreign correspondence group who arrived in Yenan in May 1944, just as Lindsay and his family were arriving. So shortly after they got there, Lindsay met up again with Zhu De, who is the commander of the communist armies. And Zhu De was an old friend. They had known each other now for some years. Zhu De was excited to have Lindsay arrive, appointed him as technical advisor to the 18th Group Army, which is the main Communist Party force, officially part of the Chinese army headed by the communist great rivals, the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party of China, the KMT, but operating very autonomously. So he was named technical advisor to the 18th Group Army, a grand title, but he found that the 3rd Bureau of the Central Military Commission, which was responsible for military communications, really gave Lindsay a cold shoulder. They really weren't interested in having his suggestions. They weren't interested in implementing any of the designs that he put forward. He, in great frustration, would later write a letter to the chief of staff of the communist military, saying, although I am nominally technical advisor to Sanju, the 3rd Bureau, they have practically never consulted me or asked my advice about anything. He gives some hint of perhaps why the relations became rather fraught. He had sometimes a very direct way of approaching people. And that seemed to be fine in Jinchaji. It was okay to have some of the foreign experts pushing back hard on things, talking plainly. But that didn't work so well in Yenan. In this memo that he sent, he talked about being very frustrated that he had designed a new set, but they had assigned somebody incompetent to produce it. So to quote, "The shielding had been omitted, so it was very doubtful if it could have worked satisfactorily. I was naturally very annoyed and pulled the half-finished set to pieces, on which people were very annoyed with me for losing my temper and complained that I had hurt the feelings of the man who was building the set, to which I replied that people who did that kind of incompetent work ought to have their feelings hurt." So this was a sort of attitude that didn't go over well in Yenan, and probably explains quite a lot about why Sanju, after a while, actually not after a while, they just decided that they really weren't interested in having him do any of the upgrades that he kind of felt that they needed to do. And he was frustrated too that they were sending out sets to the front areas that he thought were inadequate, were not going to work properly, when there were easy fixes, and he wasn't, but the Sanju wasn't interested in implementing them. So he found other work, though. So he, with the blessing of the Communist Party leadership, including Zhu De, in 1944, soon after he came, he convinced the leadership to let him design a more powerful transmitter and a V-shaped antenna for the Xinhua news agency's efforts to broadcast. They were unable to broadcast any distance, really. He felt that one of the big problems in the war was that the world wasn't getting any information about what was happening in North China, happening in the communist areas, because the Kuomintang, their great rivals in the south, were censoring all communications that included any mention of communists. And so the world was relying on Japanese reports about what was happening in North China. And of course, the Japanese reports were suggesting that things were going swimmingly in North China for the Japanese, and that they were sending the communist armies fleeing, that they had captured all sorts of prisoners, they had captured material, and really, the communists, and therefore soon the Chinese, were sort of on their last legs. So he wanted the communists to be able to put out news to the world that gave another side of that story and said that actually the communist forces were being really quite successful at pushing back the Japanese, and had captured Japanese soldiers and Japanese trucks and technology and so on. So that was the idea. He built them this transmitter. He designed the transmitter. They helped him build it. He designed this V-shaped antenna. It took up an entire valley in Yenan. It was a huge, huge thing, and it took a lot of very complicated calculations to get there, but in the end, he built it such that the signal would bounce off the atmosphere in such a way that it would land in both India and San Francisco. And that signal was actually very quickly picked up in San Francisco as soon as Yenan went on air with its broadcasts. It was transcribed and it was circulated around the US government in a report called Radio Reports from the Far East, and it also went into some other reports of radio reports from occupied areas, resistance reports from other theaters around the world. He then settled into a new position as the first English language advisor to the Xinhua News Agency, trying to teach them Western journalism principles, which had very limited success. On the last day of the war, the Japanese surrender, Lindsay was again listening to the radio, because that's what he liked to do. He was listening to the radio in the guest house that he was assigned in Yenan, and he was using earphones. He heard a Reuters dispatch on the radio saying that Japan had just unconditionally surrendered. He sent his wife to tell the manager of the guest house that he had just heard that Japan had surrendered. The manager felt that he needed to notify Chairman Mao immediately. So he called Mao's secretary, Ye Zilong, and asked him to tell Mao. Ye Zilong said, actually, the chairman has already got that report. Li Guangsheng at the Xinhua News Agency gave it to him. But Mao didn't know whether it was confirmed or not. But now that Lindsay's also heard it, it seems that this good news is indeed accurate. So within an hour, everyone in Yenan was on the streets beating gongs and drums in celebration. And with that, Lindsay sort of felt his work was done. The communists asked him to stay. They wanted him to go to Zhangjiakou. They wanted him to help with the next stage of their efforts, which was to beat the Kuomintang, their great rivals, the nationalists, and take power in China. Lindsay felt that was inappropriate. He was a British citizen. He'd been, in his eyes, doing Allied war service. He couldn't serve in Britain. He was serving in China with a British ally, China, and serving an army that was technically part of this bigger Chinese army headed by the nationalists. He didn't feel that he could be involved in a civil war. He couldn't help Chinese fight Chinese. That felt wrong. So he decided to leave, and he and his family left China 2 months later in November 1945. And that's them. That's a picture of the family. Sorry, that's a repeat of the slide. But that's a picture of the family, which now included a son, Jim, who was born in Yenan in January of 1945 in a cave, as the communists in Yenan lived in these caves built into the hills. So he was born in a cave that was part of an international peace hospital in Yenan. And he is now inherited a title that Michael's father had a title in Britain, and Michael inherited it, and then Jim, his son, has now inherited it. So when he inherited that title, there was a tongue-in-cheek little report in the Daily Telegraph in Britain saying, "Cave Lord," that Britain now had a new member of the House of Lords who had been born in a cave in the Communist Party headquarters in World War II. I'll end there and be happy to take questions. Thank you. Charles, I think there's a mic coming.
Thank you. Wonderful talk, Susan. So, what of this story did you know from family, and what did you learn in your research, and of the latter, what surprised you the most?
Excellent question, thank you. So I thought I knew this story quite well going in. My husband suggested to me that I knew this story very well going in, and I didn't need to do a whole lot more research. But what I really enjoyed in this 6 months that I've had was actually digging into the Chinese sources. So I found a whole lot of first-person Chinese accounts of many of these events that I only knew from the perspective of my grandparents. I found a really wonderful account from a workman at Yanjing who had worked with Lindsay in supplying the communists. That workman was a member of the Communist Party underground, and so he gave a really detailed account of how he and Lindsay started working together. And it actually started when Lindsay showed up in his workroom one day and said, "Hey, I've set up this Japanese railway sabotage group with a student at Yanjing, and we want to make these triangular-shaped iron things that we want to put on railway tracks in order to derail Japanese trains. Can you help us?" And at that point, the workman thought, this is somebody who seems like perhaps somebody who is in a good position to help the underground Communist Party resistance. But he talked about how they had worked together, and then he also gave a really detailed account of their escape from Yanjing, which I had only known from my grandparents' perspective of leaving. He was still left. So he talked about how the Japanese, 10 minutes after they left, came and interrogated him about what had just happened, where had the Lindsays gone. He had helped to check out the car that they used to escape. So they said, the Japanese said, "You checked out the car. Where are they?" And he also seems to have played a key role in misdirecting the Japanese so that they didn't go look in the right place for them. And also of actually tipping them off that Pearl Harbor was going to happen, which is a longer story of how he knew that. I also found this wonderful account from Lin Shuang about these classes in Jinchaji. So I knew that they taught these classes. I had no idea, just really, really specific details, including what to me was gold, was a list of every one of the 26 men who were in these classes, which allowed me then to start looking at each of these men and what happened to them, what were their careers, where did they go, and I was really taken aback to discover where some of them had gone. Some of them I did know I knew that they'd been very senior, but I didn't know the details of what they'd done. and that was a surprise. And also just, I guess I was very struck by how strategic Rongzhen was in the way that he approached this whole idea of technology, of building a technological base in the middle of a war, in very straitened circumstances. He nonetheless wanted guys who understood theoretical physics and advanced calculus. He wanted those guys, and he wanted them then, long before the communists came to power. I mean, the communists didn't come to power till 1949. Rongzhen was thinking about this in 1941. He had the class going in early 1942. So that was a surprise. Maybe I'll stop there, but there are other lessons too. David.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you've given us a very vivid picture of how your grandfather changed history. I'm just wondering, have you given some thought, if he had decided to leave back in 1930, or not even gone once he realized that the Japanese invasion had already happened, even though he knew he was safe, at least in the beginning. If he hadn't been there throughout this period, how do you think things might have developed based on your knowledge of these 26 students and what they could have done on their own?
I guess I sense that Rongzhen was really, really determined to get these guys educated, and if it hadn't been for Band and Lindsay, I suspect he would have got perhaps Chinese professors from top-notch universities who maybe had joined the communists. It might have taken a little longer, but he probably would have got some of that expertise to them. Although I think what maybe was different was coming with their foreigner's perspective, the perspective that Band and Lindsay had about scientific method, which was actually one of the classes that Lindsay taught at Yanjing, was scientific method, and it was something that was his personal kind of lodestar, was the scientific method. He believed in it deeply and imparted it to everybody, and I don't know that they would have had the same approaches to science, perhaps, that they got from Band and Lindsay. It was also really important to have Wang Shiguang in that position. Wang Shiguang, I think, was the guy who made it really all work. If you hadn't had a guy like him who spoke really good English, who'd done serious university education in electrical engineering, to be the middleman between these foreign technical experts and the others, I don't think it would have worked as well either. And Wang Shiguang he was similarly instrumental in all those big projects that Rongzhen did later in the 50s and 60s. Wang Shiguang was the key figure in all that.
Hi, Susan. Thank you. That was really interesting. How did your grandparents acclimate to Britain when they returned?
They were helped by the fact that Michael's parents were incredibly welcoming, which is not something that you could take for granted. In Britain at that time, the idea that Michael had a Chinese wife and children, who were mixed race, you can see the attitude in Britain at the time by the press coverage that they got, and there was a lot. And in fact, when A.D. Lindsay, Michael's father, died, he was a really quite significant figure in his time. He had been the master of one of the top colleges in Britain, etc. But his obituaries routinely said things like, A.D. Lindsay dies, son married Chinese girl. That was it was such an unusual, wild thing. But Michael's parents were very, very welcoming of Xiaoli. They really supported her. They wanted her to be happy and supported. And they did things like they invited, there was another Chinese family in Oxford at the time, and Michael's mother, who was often socially a little awkward and could be a little shy, but she made a point of inviting the daughter from that Chinese family to tea at Balliol to meet Xiaoli, and they became great friends, and that daughter took Xiaoli home to her family, and introduced her to her mother, and Xiaoli and her mother became very fast friends. And that family, we have a member of that family in the audience today, we have been friends for, our families have been friends for 4 generations at this point, I think maybe 5 generations. So it's very special to have them here with us. In that sense, that was a very, very important. Michael had a difficult time, though. He had a difficult time getting a job in the UK. And the reason was because, of course, he had had all the service with the Chinese communists, and it was now 1945, and the world was beginning to wonder about working with communists and thinking that maybe this isn't such a good thing. He was also tagged as being anti-American because he'd had some, because he'd been critical of some of the things that the US had done in the war in China. And so he ended up, though, ironically, he had trouble getting a job in Britain, so he came to the United States, and he ended up taking a visiting professorship at Harvard, under working with John Fairbank at Harvard, whom he'd known during the war, and then went back to Britain and found an academic position, ultimately at the University of Hull. And then they moved on to Australia, Australian National University, and then they came here to American University in the late 50s. I guess 59, he came to American University. And she took my grandmother slightly longer to come here because of US immigration policies at the time, but Congress passed a private bill deeming her to have been born in Britain, which allowed her to enter the US under the British quota and got her here.
Leaders in Yunnan during his time there? If so, what was the response?
So Lindsay, one of the big themes in his writings was that he thought extremely highly of the communist organization in Jinchaji under Rongzhen. He was very increasingly critical of Yenan. He really didn't, he had a lot of things that he felt that Yenan needed to fix. And so it was issues of, yes, terrible bureaucratic obstacles in Yenan, that he was sort of shocked that to go anywhere, if he wanted to meet anybody, he needed to have a letter of introduction from his unit to their unit. It was all terribly formal. And yes, that leaders seemed a lot more distant from people in Yenan. He actually ended up writing a long 50-page, 60-page report before he left called What is Wrong with Yenan, which enumerated all these details in excruciating detail. And I have been searching for this report for years. I know that he gave copies to various people, but I have been unable to track this down. I maybe naively asked the communist authorities if they might have a copy they might be willing to show me, but no, they claimed not to have such a copy in their files. But particularly because Yenan in China is celebrated as holy. It is actually called holy. And the Yenan spirit is something that the communists like to invoke all the time, and Xi Jinping likes to invoke the Yenan spirit. My grandfather was very unimpressed by the Yenan spirit and much preferred the Jinchaji spirit. Mark.
Susan, could you talk a bit about the sources that you used in your research, especially here?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of my most useful source was a Chinese database, which is just a wonderful, wonderful database. It was the kind of database that I could put in a name, or I could put in any detail, and it had full text searchable capabilities and was able to just pop up all sorts of very, very obscure materials. And that's where I found actually a lot of these primary accounts that I was able to find, which I didn't know existed. And they're in some very, very obscure Chinese publications, but thanks to this database, I found them. So that was a huge thing. The Foreign Office records, British Foreign Office records, have been digitized, and the library has a subscription to the Foreign Office records on China. And that's great because a number of, as I mentioned in that early slide, Lindsay, although he was doing all this work for the communists, was a very patriotic Brit. And so at the same time was writing these long reports for the British government about everything he was seeing and sort of analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the communist army and so on, and getting those out to the embassy and other figures in Britain. So those reports have been captured in the Foreign Office files. A lot of those are in the Foreign Office files. And the Foreign Office files are great because you also see how those reports were received in London. Each of those files has a report cover in which you see debates about the contents of the file playing out in copperplate handwriting, all signed, so you know exactly whose position it was when they were voicing skepticism or support or questions about things. I also found very useful, just the library's got this amazing, as we know, amazing collection of books, but I was looking for some very early British publications from the 30s, 20s, 30s, in fact, 10s, 20s, 30s. Really obscure books that you wouldn't really expect a library to have, and the library had them. So that was very, very pleasing. And of course, the manuscripts division. The Henry Luce collection has got a lot about China in it, and he was on the board of Yenjing University, so there's a lot about Yenjing in those files, and I found that very helpful for the Yenjing period. But also we have the Nelson T. Johnson papers. He was the US envoy and then US ambassador to China for a long period up until 1941. His papers are here at the library, and again, very, very helpful. Jim.
So I have a two-part question. So the first is just how unique were Band and Lindsay in terms of there being foreign advisors, technical advisors to the communists? I mean, were they essentially, certainly for the radio and things like that, they obviously were. And then also, were there comparable people with the Kuomintang? Were there foreigners advising them?
They were unusual among so the communists, there were a really pretty small group of foreigners who were working with the communists during World War II. And most of them, the biggest group of them were doctors. So there were doctors from Germany, Austria, India. I'm just trying to think some of the most prominent of those doctors, and the United States. But there were doctors who were prominent and played big roles, and a lot of those doctors stayed. They stayed in China through the Civil War and on after 1949. So they stayed all the way through. There were a smaller group of other foreigners at the time. There were some Soviets who my grandparents saw had very little sight of. They knew they were there in Yenan, but they never saw them. And this is partly, again, due to this fact that Yenan was so compartmentalized that you didn't necessarily run into people the way you did in Jinchaji. So there were some Soviets there. And the KMT, yes, they had a lot of foreign advisors. They had a long history of having foreign advisors, actually, and including radio folks. But yeah, radio, I'm not, we have in the audience here another expert on Chinese radio in that period, but I'm off the top of my head, I'm not aware of other foreigners who were working with the communists on radio specifically.
We have time for one more question, and I'll take it from the online audience.
Sure.
Have you seen or heard from any Allied or Japanese sources about the impact of Lindsay's work and the people he taught and trained during the war?
I haven't, but that's something that I probably should now look into. What I haven't done yet is looked at Japanese sources, and that's a big hole in my research. So as you can tell, my research is not done. I have a fair bit more to do. But yes, the Japanese piece is a big hole that I need to fill. Allied, these Foreign Office files do have some very detailed debates about his work and what to make of it. The Foreign Office, I think, was most concerned that people would think that he was officially representing the British government in doing this work. They were really quite worried that he would be seen to be a British agent, and which he was not. And the Americans, though, interestingly, there were American official sources which did list him as a likely British agent who had been planted in the communist areas. And the communists themselves, there were some of the communists thought that he was a British agent. So he certainly, the fact that he kind of juggled so many different roles lent itself to a lot of confusion about whose side he was on. I should mention perhaps that he became a very, very staunch critic of the communists after they came to power. He was actually among their staunchest critics, and that, I think he was given a lot of credibility in his criticisms because he knew the communists so well, because he had spent time with them. He knew Mao, he knew Zhou Enlai, he knew all these people. And so when he was so critical of what they did when they came to power, it made an impact. He was banned from China for a long period. He was written out of the history books. He only began to be rehabilitated, that's a communist jargon for you, but they decided to revisit their verdict on him in the 1980s. And it really happened with the publication of his book, which had been published in English. He wrote a book of photographs with accompanying text, published it in Britain in 1975. In 1987, they published a Chinese edition, and that was rehabilitating him. And it was, I think, largely his friends, his students, who probably, I have no evidence for this, but I assume that they argued for him in senior leadership circles and said, actually, this guy deserves a little bit of credit for some of the things he did during the war that he didn't have to do, but he did to help China against Japan.
Well, Susan, I want to thank you for your time and your work here, and for this talk today. I think you're a great example of the sort of research and work that our library staff can do on the Kluge Staff Fellowship. So thank you very much. If I could ask those of you in attendance, if you could fill out one of the feedback forms before you leave. We do use those to maintain and improve the quality of our programming. And if you're on Zoom, if you could fill out the questionnaire at the end. And if we could all thank Susan for a lovely talk.
Thank you.